Abraham's Idolatrous Family. And as Richard was saying, we've just got this book published, the commentary on Genesis 1 to 11, and it's really on the back of this that I'm doing this seminar. It's a bit of a reflection on what we actually did. If you've ever published a book, by the time you get to it being published, you've forgotten why you did some of what you did. So as I was preparing this paper, I went back and read what we had written about Abraham's family, and then tried to analyze a little bit of why we'd done what we'd done. So this paper is to a large extent based on my analysis of this book that we produced from Bangladesh. So the subtitle here is Qur'anic and Rabbinic Literature as a Context for Christian Interpretation of Genesis 11 to 12. So those of you who know me will know that I have, ever since I did my dissertation back in the 1990s, been suggesting to Old Testament scholars that they might usefully consider the Quran as a commentary on aspects of the Old Testament, and a very important commentary because of the authority that it is understood to have by so many millions of people. And by and large, people look askance and say, what on earth could that mean? How could we learn something about the Bible from something that is written so much later than the Bible? And in more recent years, people have taken more notice of the Bible, of the Quran, as part of the reception history of the Bible. But what that might do to one's actual interpretation of the Bible is a question that I've been trying to push, and many people seem to resist even the question. So we're going to take that question to this passage of Genesis, in Genesis 11, because for the people in Bangladesh and in many other places, the Quranic material is actually part of the context in which they are reading Genesis, whether we like it or not, or whether they like it or not. And I think most of us these days do recognize that the context does affect the way in which we read. So whether it's the Quran or anything else is going to affect us. So here is the passage. I'll read it for those of you who are not familiar with it. These are the generations of Terah. The word generations is toledot, which signals the different sections of Genesis. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So often for Christian readers, this is just a little passage that gets you from the boring stuff of the previous genealogy of Shem to the interesting stuff of the actual call of Abraham. And it's just a little bit of background. But for these Bengali readers, this is a hugely important passage, not only about the family of Abraham, but also about the idolatrous family of Abraham. And they are interested in both parts of my title, both the family and the idolatry. So in the case of the family, and we're not going to spend a huge amount of time about this, but this is part of the context. They are very, very interested in the genealogy and the genealogical structure of Genesis. That's what it is. This is about the family. And Genesis 1 to 11 is, among other things, the genealogy of the family of Abraham. So in Bangladesh, Muslim people like to consider themselves as being part of the Milati Ibrahim, which they don't just consider as the faith of Abraham, but as the family of Abraham. And into English, they would sometimes even translate it, the family of Abraham. We are part of Abraham's people, if you like. So who are Abraham's family is really important to them. The barrenness of Sarah, of Sarai, is obviously a very striking thing in a culture where barrenness can be such a problem. And they really pick up the barrenness of Sarah in the context of the genealogical fertility that we have seen prior to this in Genesis. The other thing that really concerns them is the relationship between Abraham and his father, because if you do the sums, you find that Abraham went off and left his elderly father long before his father's death. How could that be? What was going on there? So all these questions are being taken into the reading of this passage. What about the idolatry? This is just an image of seeing the moon god. I believe this is actually a Syrian image. But we all know that the world behind the Genesis text is an idolatrous one, and that is something that is extremely important for the Bangladeshi readers. Now, Genesis 1 to 11 doesn't actually mention any of the gods in the world behind the text. It's not until we get to the book of Joshua that, as Joshua is recounting the overall history of the people of Israel, that he has this, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Now, does this matter? Well, it seems to me that most of the Western commentaries on Genesis 11 are not particularly interested. So somebody like John Goldingay, who's got a massive, huge new commentary on Genesis, just says it might be tempting to attribute Haran's death to his serving other gods, but he was hardly the only one. See Joshua 24:2. That's all he says about this in his commentary on Genesis 11, although he's got a footnote which looks more at the idolatrous context here. But to the Bengali readers, it does matter. And here is this key verse that we're going to look at, which gives us the clue, which John Goldingay notes the clue in, that Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. Note this ESV translation. Haran died in the presence of his father. Because when we come to the way that the rabbinic material deals with this verse, they have a whole lot of questions. What is this Ur of the Chaldeans? You will read that there were some cities by the name of Ur, and that this Ur of the Chaldeans was one particular city called Ur. You will also read that the word Ur sounds a bit like the word Ir, although the letters are different, which is translated city in Genesis chapter 11. What you don't so often read in Christian commentaries is that the word Ur here is the same as the word for light in Genesis chapter 1, and it can mean light or fire. So what is this Ur of the Chaldeans. What is translated in the ESV, in the presence of, is alphane, in or before the face of his father. And it's sometimes interpreted as meaning, referring to time, that he died during the lifetime of his father. Or as it's translated into English, before his father. But does it mean in the lifetime, or does it mean actually in the presence of his father? And of course, the rabbis want to know, why are we told this detail? Because if the Torah comes from God, every word of it, then every word of it matters. But how does it relate to the context set in earlier in Genesis 10 and 11? So if we're reading forward from Genesis, we read the rabbinic material, and here is the Genesis Rabbah, which certainly predates the Quran. Haran died in the presence of his father, and Rabbi here said Terah was a manufacturer of idols. He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell them in his place. A man came in and wished to buy one. How old are you? Abraham asked the man. 50 years old, he said. Woe to such a man who is 50 years old and would worship a day-old object, Abraham said. On another occasion, a woman came in with a plate full of fire and requested him, take this and offer it to them. So he took a stick and broke them, that is the idols, and put the stick in the hand of the largest. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? I cannot conceal it from you. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed, I must eat first, while another claimed, I must eat first. Thereupon, Terah seized him and delivered him to Nimrod. And Nimrod says, let us worship fire. And Abraham says, let us worship water, which quenches fire. And we go on down here. I won't read it all because it takes a while. And eventually, Nimrod says, we'll worship nothing but fire. I'm going to put you in it and let your God whom you adore come and save you from it. So here's a key thing. Haran is standing there looking on, and he says, if Abraham is victorious, I will say that I am of Abraham's belief. While if Nimrod is victorious, I will say that I am on Nimrod's side. And of course, Abraham gets saved, and Nimrod says to him, of whose belief are you? Of Abraham's, he says. So Nimrod puts him in the fire, and because he's not a true believer, he dies in the presence of his father. So this represents a major line of rabbinic thought, which comes right down to today. If we on into the Quran, and many of you listening today will be thoroughly familiar with this, the story of Abraham and the idols occurs in 8 different places. We have in there reasoning about monotheism from observation of the universe, which has some parallel with that discussion with Nimrod, but also with some of the rabbinic thinking about Abraham's being asked by God to count the stars, smashing his father's idols there several times, confrontation with a king, and then being thrown into a fire and rescued from it by God. I'll just let you have a couple of minutes to look at these passages, glance through them, in case you're unfamiliar with them, before we go on to see what the Quran is, how our commentary dealt with this context. From Surah 21, and note at the bottom, they said, burn him and help your gods if you are to do anything. We said, O fire, be cool and safe for Abraham. They plotted to harm him, but we made them the biggest losers. Here's the verse that definitely links him with a king. So when we read forward, we can do the reception history thing. We can do the this influenced that thing. We can do the God was speaking to people about what they knew thing. But what about when we read in the other direction? And this is what we're doing in the commentary. We're reading out of this context of people who know the Quranic stories to a study of the Genesis stories. Now, if you think that the Quran is the authoritative text, then you think that the Quran is helping you to understand what's going on in Genesis. If you're doing it from a Christian perspective or a more agnostic perspective on the Quran, then you're using the Quran as part of your context. And rather than going forward from Genesis to the Quran, we use the rabbinic stories as a bridge back into Genesis. So we moved from the Quranic stories to saying, well, what might they be dealing with and referring to in the Genesis stories? And some of that we can find out by reading these rabbinic bridges, and that then takes us back to Genesis with the set of questions that the Quran has raised. And the question that any biblical scholar is going to ask is, well, what difference does that make to the reading of the world, your reading of the world behind the text, your reading of the world of the text, and your reading of the world in front of the text? So in the commentary, having looked at some of this background context, we summarize some of the questions that arise. Where did Abraham and family come from, and why does it matter? How does this relate to the whole context of Genesis 10 and 11 and to Joshua 24? What might it have meant to Abraham and to his family to have left Ur and then Haran? What does this tell us about the choices made by the various characters within the world of their time? And how did the Bani Israel, the people of Israel, relate to the surrounding idolatrous nations and to the imperial powers represented by them? Now note that none of this is taking the story of Haran and the fire as true in the sense that it actually happened, because there's no indication in the Genesis text that it did. But it's taking us back to the Genesis text, alert to these questions. And note that most of them have to do with the world behind the Genesis text. But you might think that reading in a new context would change the way you handle the world of the text. But prior to that, in this Bangladeshi context, it alerts us to the world behind the texts and sends us back to it. And only then do we ask, how does all this relate to what might have happened, might have mattered for the early Muslim community, and therefore to the Quran's choice of the Abraham narratives? How does it relate to what matters in our Bangladeshi community today, so to the world in front of the text? So in the commentary itself, the way this is dealt with is first the setting up of the story, which is looking, interestingly, at the Toledot of Shem, this genealogy from Shem to Terah. The chapter on this passage of Genesis 11, it is the second half of a chapter which includes that Shem Toledot. So it's very deliberately putting the study of Genesis 11 into the context of genealogy, and this is stressed. It's interesting that in working with this genealogy, they are looking at the idolatrous background. And they make a contrast between the idolatrous background from which the Bani Israel came and the Bangladeshi background from which the Bangladeshi diaspora today comes. There is an important difference between ancient Jews and today's scattered Bangladeshis. While Bangladeshis in Britain tell their children, the people in that village are our people, the ancient Jews told their children, the people in those areas are not of religion and are no longer their people. The places mentioned were to become the centers of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, which would often be the enemies of the Bani Israel and would take them into exile. It was from these areas that Abram was called by God. You see the way the alerting to the idolatrous family is already affecting the way that you read the genealogy prior to it. There's then a substantial section on the geography and history of the time, with a focus particularly on the moon worship, a comparison between the huge temple to Sin in Ur of the Chaldeans and the huge temple to Marduk in Babylon, which we've just read of in the Tower of Babel story. And there's also great interest in the names in the chapter and the way some of those names can be read as reflecting idolatrous worship, in particular relating to the moon. I won't tell you all about that. They then have the structure, and we're really into chiastic structures. So the section is seen as being structured beginning at Terah and his family in the idolatrous city of Ur with its temple, and moving us through the leaving, the settlement, and the sevenfold blessing to Abraham going, setting out, taking the family, and traveling through Canaan and setting up altars to the Lord. So a deliberate contrast is set up between the idolatrous city of Ur with its worship and the traveling through Canaan with the worship of God without any fixed temple and with the setting up of altars. So that's setting up a theological contrast within the story. We then come to the specific discussion about idolatry. And it's interesting that there's ongoing discussion of idolatry, because when we get to Haran the place, that's not Haran the person, it's Haran the place, we find that they too had a temple to the moon god Sin. The commentary says, so perhaps that is why Terah stopped there. We might even guess that he found work again there in making idols. And it then goes on to discuss what the text and the New Testament might have said. But there's a great concern about why Terah moved and why they landed up in this other place of idolatry, so that Haran becomes another place of idolatry, which now Abram has to leave. And as we move on from there, the focus becomes disruption. There is the disruption of idolatry, but the concern is going to move on to other disruptions. that as Abraham goes, there's this focus on the disruption of fertility, the lack of fertility of Sarah, which I've mentioned. But I want to focus a little bit more now on the disruption of family. This is clearly a very important concern in the Bengali thinking. So there's a question of, sorry, no, I'll go back. There's the question of why Abraham could have left his family. And there's a real concern that he, as the one son who was with his father rather the elder son who was with his father there, should leave his father and abandon him. So the question arises then about what is one's responsibility to the unbelieving family. Again, the rabbis are helpful because they say that they have a story about how God said to him, look, it's not the people of idolatry that are your family. Your father's idolatry effectively dissolves your responsibility to him, so you can leave him. I think perhaps the best way of giving you a feel of the way the commentary deals with this is to simply read some of the commentary. And yeah, Abraham must leave his family and relatives and lose them. Undoubtedly, Asians feel the heart-wrenching impact of this command. Surely God would not want to destroy the family ties. Is not honor your father and mother central in the 10 Commandments? Did not Jesus the Messiah chide religious leaders for failing to serve their parents? The Quran too upholds the importance of filial responsibility. This may be why the Quran does not refer to Abraham being told to leave his family, but simply to go to a land which will benefit all. It seems that after God spoke to Abraham in Ur, he left his home and his wider kin, but he did not leave his father's household. On the contrary, Genesis 11:31 implies that his father was leading the party. Now, because Terah has either died or refused to continue the journey, God explicitly tells Abraham to leave his father's house, to set off again and to leave behind anyone who does not want to come with him. God's plan for the new family to grow from Abraham and Sarai is even more important than the honoring of parents. No wonder Jewish tradition sees this call as one of the great tests of Abraham's faith. The Quran affirms that Abraham was tested through various commands, and Islamic tradition echoes Jewish tradition that there were 10 tests. Hebrews uses his faithfulness as an example for us to follow, focusing on the fact that this verse does not tell Abraham where to go. He may know that the general area is Canaan, but the exact direction which God will give him is unknown. He needs to depend entirely on God's direction. So there's some of the grappling with the problem of Abraham leaving his family. But when we get to the what about us section towards the end, the application within Bangladesh comes out. What does it mean to us in Bangladesh today? Like Noah, Abraham shows extraordinary loyalty to the one true God. His response to God's call was to sacrifice his wealth, his father's home, and the city he lived in. And it looks at how this story is echoed in Bangladesh, and particularly in the case of people who decide they want to follow Jesus from Muslim background. And Abraham's leaving of his family is seen as a huge encouragement to any believer who is disagreeing with his family. But as we go on, we come back to the question that we had earlier on in the chapter. We want to be part of the people of Ibrahim. What does this mean? Who are the true people of Ibrahim? And that's the question that this Genesis 1 to 11 commentary is going to raise for the readers of Genesis. But finally, just to take the hermeneutical circle round a little bit further, what of the Abraham story would have been particularly important for the people, the early Muslims of Quranic times? Well, fairly obviously, what was most relevant to them was this question of his call from his idolatrous family. It was there in Jewish tradition. It's there by implication in Genesis 11. It's not too surprising if the Quran focuses on Abraham as the monotheist within that context. It's not too surprising then that the Bangladeshis pick up on the idolatrous text, on the idolatrous world behind the Genesis text, not only in their reading of Genesis 11, but in the whole of their reading of Genesis 1 to 11. So there's a little bit of a reflection on what we did. And I hope that it serves to help us to see that reading in this Islamic context can cause us to come back to the Genesis text and to the world behind the text with fresh questions and fresh eyes. Thank you.